I first heard the hum when I moved to Taos, New Mexico, in search of a quieter life. After years of chaos in the city, the idea of small-town serenity was irresistible. Little did I know the serenity was an illusion, a veil hiding something ancient and dark, something that was about to unravel my very sanity. I remember the day I arrived. The town seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. I had rented a small house on the outskirts of town, nestled against the foothills, where the mountains loomed like silent sentinels. The locals were friendly enough, but there was something off. An unspoken tension lingered in their eyes, a hesitation in their voices whenever I asked about the town's history or peculiarities. The first night, I slept like a baby, but it was on the second night that everything changed. It started as a faint vibration in my ears, like the distant thrum of an old engine. I assumed it was a truck passing by, but when I looked out the window, the road was empty. The hum persisted, growing slightly louder until it was impossible to ignore. A low-frequency drone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried to sleep, but the hum invaded my thoughts, worming its way into my dreams, turning them into disjointed nightmares. By morning I was exhausted, but the hum had stopped, for the moment. When I mentioned it to my neighbor, an older man named Carlos, he stiffened. His weathered face, usually creased with a friendly smile, became unreadable. "That's the hum," he said flatly. "You'll get used to it." "Get used to it?" I asked, confused. "What is it?" "No one knows. Some say it's just the wind in the mountains. Others think it's something to do with the earth. You'll hear all kinds of stories, but none of them explain it." I pressed him further, but he was clearly done talking about it. Before he walked away, though, he added almost as an afterthought, "Best to ignore it if you can. Don't go looking for answers." That night, the hum returned. Louder! It felt like it was vibrating through my bones, resonating in my skull. I covered my ears, but it did no good. The sound wasn't external, it was inside me, pulsing with a rhythm that felt alive. I tried to drown it out with music, but it only grew louder, more insistent, like it was demanding my attention. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a sound, but a message, a call from something deep, something ancient. As the nights went on, sleep became a distant memory. The hum consumed me, its relentless drone driving me to the edge of madness. My thoughts became fragmented, disjointed. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any, shapes that dissolved the moment I turned my head. Desperate for answers, I began to ask around town. Most people brushed me off with vague explanations, but there were a few who seemed genuinely afraid. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing around nervously as if the hum itself could hear them. They told me about people who had disappeared, driven mad by the sound, vanishing without a trace. One name kept coming up: Dr. Evelyn Moore, a retired scientist who had moved to Taos years ago to study the hum. According to the locals, she had been obsessed with it, convinced that it wasn't just a natural phenomenon, but something far more sinister. Driven by my growing obsession, I tracked her down. She lived in a decrepit house on the far edge of town, surrounded by a thicket of dead trees. The hum was stronger there, almost deafening. When Dr. Moore opened the door, I was struck by how gaunt and hollow she looked. Her eyes were wide, almost feverish, as if she hadn't slept in years. "You heard it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice a raspy whisper. I nodded, too unnerved to speak. She let me in, and her house was as disheveled as she was. Piles of papers, strange diagrams, and old audio equipment cluttered every surface. "The hum," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. "It's not what they think. It's not the earth, not the wind. It's something else. Something alive." My heart raced as she explained her theory. According to Dr. Moore, the hum was a signal, a call from deep beneath the earth, from something that had been there for centuries, maybe millennia, something that was waking up. "I've recorded it," she said, her hands shaking as she handed me a set of headphones connected to a reel-to-reel tape recorder. "Listen." I hesitated but put the headphones on. At first it was just the hum, the same sound that had been tormenting me for days. But then, something else. A voice, speaking in a language I didn't understand, but one that filled me with a primal dread. I ripped the headphones off, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you hear it now?" she asked, her eyes wide with terror. "Do you understand?" Before I could answer, there was a sudden, violent tremor. The entire house shook, and I heard it, a deep, guttural growl rising from beneath the floorboards. The hum grew louder, more intense, until it was all I could hear, drowning out everything else. Dr. Moore grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "It's coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the deafening noise. "You have to get out of here, now!" But I was frozen, paralyzed by the sound, by the terror that gripped me. I could feel it. Whatever was down there, rising, breaking free. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tremor stopped. The hum faded, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I stumbled out of the house, my mind reeling. As I fled, I glanced back and saw Dr. Moore standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on the ground, a look of resignation on her face. That night, the hum didn't come, but I couldn't sleep. I knew it wasn't over. Something had been awakened, and it was only a matter of time before it came for me. And as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that the hum wasn't just a sound, it was a warning. A warning that whatever was beneath the earth was coming. And when it did, no one in Taos would be safe. The days following my visit to Dr. Moore's house were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. The hum was gone, but its absence was somehow more unnerving than its presence. It was like the calm before a storm, a silence that felt wrong, unnatural, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your instincts scream at you to run. But where could I go? Taos was a small town, isolated in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And something told me that whatever was coming, it wouldn't stop at the town's borders. The people I encountered in town seemed oblivious to the tension in the air, going about their daily lives as if nothing had changed. But there was an underlying unease in their eyes, a shared fear that no one wanted to acknowledge. I couldn't shake the memory of Dr. Moore's voice, trembling with fear as she warned me to leave. I thought about the recording she'd made, the voice hidden within the hum, speaking in that strange alien language. What if it wasn't a warning at all, but a summons? The thought haunted me as I wandered aimlessly through the town, trying to piece together what I'd learned. The hum was a call, a signal from something ancient and malevolent deep beneath the earth. But what was it calling for? And why now? As I walked past the local library, an idea struck me. If there was something buried beneath Taos, something old and powerful, there had to be some record of it. A legend, a myth, anything that might give me a clue. The library was small, dusty, and smelled of old paper. The librarian, a frail woman with silver hair and a wary smile, greeted me with a nod as I entered. I spent hours combing through old books and newspapers, searching for anything that could explain the hum. I found stories of strange disappearances, of people who claimed to hear the hum and were never seen again. There were vague references to ancient Native American legends, tales of spirits and creatures that lived beneath the mountains, but nothing concrete. Nothing that could explain what was happening now. Frustrated, I was about to give up when I stumbled upon a small, leather-bound journal, hidden among a pile of old books. The cover was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. Inside, the handwriting was neat but faded, the ink smudged in places. The journal belonged to a man named John Harrington, a prospector who had lived in Taos in the late 1800s. As I read through his entries, I realized he had been obsessed with the same hum that now plagued me. Harrington wrote about the sound, describing it much as I had experienced it. A low, persistent vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. He believed it was a sign, a clue to something buried deep beneath the mountains. Gold, he thought at first. But as time went on, his entries grew darker, more frantic. He wrote about dreams, nightmares of being trapped underground, surrounded by darkness, with something monstrous moving just beyond the edge of his vision. He described hearing voices, whispers in a language he didn't understand, promising him untold riches if he would just dig deeper, just keep going. The last entry was dated December 12, 1889. "I have found it," Harrington wrote, his handwriting barely legible. "The source of the hum. It's not gold, not treasure. It's something else, something alive. It called to me, drew me to it, and now I'm afraid I've gone too far. I can hear it beneath me, scratching, clawing its way to the surface. I must seal the entrance, bury it before it's too late. But the hum, it's so loud now. I fear it may already be too late." There was no further entry. Harrington had disappeared shortly after, his body never found. The locals assumed he had gone mad, lost in the mountains. But after reading his journal, I wasn't so sure. What if Harrington had uncovered something real? What if whatever he found was still down there, waiting? I knew I had to find the place Harrington had described, the source of the hum. If there was a chance to stop it before it reached the surface, I had to take it. But I couldn't do it alone. That night, I returned to Dr. Moore's house. The air was thick with tension, the silence almost suffocating. The hum had not returned, but the memory of it lingered, an oppressive weight pressing down on my chest. Dr. Moore answered the door, her face pale and drawn. She didn't seem surprised to see me, as if she'd been expecting my return. "I found something," I said, holding up Harrington's journal. "I think I know where the hum is coming from." Her eyes widened as she took the journal from my hands, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. This is incredible," she whispered. I'd heard rumors about Harrington, but I never imagined... "We have to find it," I said, my voice trembling with urgency. "We have to stop it before it's too late." She looked up at me, her expression filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "You're right. But you have to understand, whatever is down there, it's not just some old relic. It's alive, and it's dangerous." "I know," I replied, my resolve hardening. But we don't have a choice. Dr. Moore nodded, closing the journal with a snap. Then we need to prepare. We can't just go down there blindly. We need to know what we're dealing with. As we began to gather supplies, a sense of foreboding settled over me. The further we dug into Harrington's journal, the more convinced I became that we were about to unearth something that should have remained buried. And as we descended into the darkness beneath Taos, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That something was waiting for us, just beyond the reach of our lights. Something that had been waiting for a very long time. The morning of our expedition into the mountains, the sky was a dull, oppressive gray, mirroring the unease that churned in my gut. Dr. Moore and I had spent the night preparing, poring over maps, packing supplies, and reviewing Harrington's journal until the words blurred together. Despite our efforts, I couldn't shake the sense of impending doom that clung to me like a shroud. Dr. Moore was eerily calm, her usual nervous energy replaced by a grim determination. She moved with purpose, as if she had already resigned herself to whatever fate awaited us. I envied her composure. My own hands were shaking so badly I could barely lace up my boots. The mountains loomed before us as we set out, their jagged peaks shrouded in mist. The path we followed was narrow and treacherous, winding through dense forests and up steep inclines. The further we climbed, the more the landscape seemed to change, becoming harsher, more desolate. The trees grew twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. As we walked, the silence became suffocating. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, were conspicuously absent. Even the wind had stilled, leaving only the sound of our footsteps crunching against the gravelly earth. We reached the entrance to the old mine shaft by midday. It was exactly as Harrington had described. A gaping maw carved into the side of the mountain, framed by crumbling rocks and overgrown with weeds. The opening was dark, the kind of blackness that seemed to swallow the light whole. Standing at the threshold, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, as if the very earth was trying to repel us. Dr. Moore handed me a flashlight, her face pale but resolute. "This is it," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Are you ready?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was, but there was no turning back now. The moment we stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, the air thick with dampness and the stench of something rotten. The hum, which had been absent since that fateful night in Dr. Moore's house, returned with a vengeance. It was louder now, a pulsating drone that seemed to come from deep within the earth, vibrating through the walls and into my bones. The tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic, the walls closing in around us as we descended deeper into the mine. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the rough stone. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, littered with debris and loose rocks that made every step a precarious one. As we ventured further, the hum grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, an oppressive force that seemed to press down on us from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears, as the sensation of being watched grew stronger. And then we found it. The tunnel opened up into a cavernous chamber, the walls slick with moisture and covered in strange, pulsating growths. The air was thick with a foul metallic odor that made my stomach churn. In the center of the chamber was a massive pit, its edges lined with crumbling stone. The hum emanated from deep within, a steady, throbbing pulse that made my head spin. Dr. Moore and I exchanged a glance, and I could see the fear in her eyes, mirroring my own. We approached the pit cautiously, our footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. As we neared the edge, the hum intensified, growing so loud it felt like my skull was about to split open. I shone my flashlight into the pit, but the light barely penetrated the darkness. The blackness was so absolute, so unnatural, that it seemed to absorb the light, swallowing it whole. But as I stared into the void, I began to see something. Movement, deep within the pit. Something shifting in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as a figure emerged from the darkness. At first, it was nothing more than a vague shape, a silhouette against the inky blackness. But as it drew closer, it began to take form. An emaciated figure. Its skin stretched tight over a skeletal frame, eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. It wasn't human. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as my hand shook. The figure continued to rise from the pit, its movements slow and deliberate as if it was savoring the moment. And then it spoke. The voice was a low, guttural growl, the words twisted and distorted, spoken in that same alien language I had heard on Dr. Moore's recording. But this time, the meaning was clear. "You came, you answered." The words echoed in my mind, filling me with a terror so profound I could hardly breathe. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place as the figure advanced. I could feel its gaze, cold and merciless, boring into me, peeling away the layers of my mind, exposing my deepest fears. Dr. Moore screamed, a sound that echoed through the cavern, raw and primal. It snapped me out of my paralysis, and I turned to see her backing away, her eyes wide with terror. But it was too late. The figure lunged at her, moving with inhuman speed, and I watched in horror as it wrapped its bony fingers around her throat. She struggled, but it was futile. The creature was impossibly strong, its grip tightening until her face turned purple, her eyes bulging. I wanted to help, to do something, but my body refused to move. I could only watch as the life drained from her eyes, her body going limp in the creature's grasp. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The creature released Dr. Moore's lifeless body, letting it crumple to the ground like a discarded doll. It turned its gaze to me, and I knew, and in that moment, that I was next. But before it could move, the hum reached a deafening crescendo, a sound so powerful it felt like the earth itself was splitting apart. The walls of the cavern trembled, cracks spider-webbing across the stone as the ground beneath us began to quake. The creature let out a howl of rage, a sound that sent a jolt of pure terror through my veins. It recoiled, its form flickering and distorting, as if the very air around it was tearing it apart. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the trembling ground. The tunnel was collapsing behind me, rocks and debris crashing down in a cacophony of destruction. But I didn't look back, I couldn't. I burst out of the mine shaft just as the entrance caved in, the roar of the collapse echoing through the mountains. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The hum was gone, replaced by the ringing in my ears and the deafening silence of the mountains. Dr. Moore was dead, and whatever was in that pit had been sealed away, at least for now. But I knew deep down that it wasn't over. The creature had spoken to me, had called out to me, and I had answered. As I lay there, staring up at the gray sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that pit. Something that was now lurking just out of sight, waiting. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, I realized with a sinking dread that I had only delayed the inevitable. I barely made it back to town, stumbling through the forest like a man in a fevered dream. My thoughts were fragmented, shattered by the horror I had witnessed. Dr. Moore's death replayed in my mind on a sickening loop. Her wide, terror-filled eyes, her strangled gasps, the way her body went limp in that creature's grasp. I couldn't shake the image, no matter how hard I tried. When I finally reached my house, it felt like a hollow shell, offering no comfort, no safety. The walls seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with the memories of what had happened in that cavern. I wanted to scream, to cry, but all I could do was collapse onto the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The creature, its skeletal form rising from the pit, those glowing eyes locked onto mine. And worse, I heard it. The hum had returned, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. It was inside my head now, burrowing into my mind, filling every thought, every dream with its unholy presence. By the third night, I was a wreck. I hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. The hum had become a constant gnawing drone, driving me to the edge of madness. My reflection in the mirror was that of a stranger. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, skin pale and stretched tight over bone. I looked like a man who had seen death and was marked by it. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. Whatever I had awakened in that pit, it wasn't going to stop. It was coming for me, and it wouldn't rest until it had what it wanted. I had to leave, to get as far away from Taos as possible. But as I packed a bag, I realized the truth. There was no running from this. The creature had called to me, had chosen me, and it would follow me wherever I went. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening to me, to figure out how to stop it before it consumed me completely. There was only one place left to go, the old mission on the outskirts of town, where the oldest records were kept. It was said that the mission's archives contained documents dating back centuries, including the earliest accounts of the region's history. If there was anything that could help me, it would be there. The mission was a crumbling relic of the past, its stone walls weathered by time and neglect. As I approached, I felt a chill crawl down my spine, as if the very air around the building was charged with a malevolent energy. The hum grew louder, a constant pulsating rhythm that seemed to resonate with the mission's ancient stones. The door creaked open with a groan, and I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old paper, and the only light came from the narrow slits of windows high above. I made my way to the archives, a labyrinth of shelves filled with yellowed documents and crumbling books. The room was oppressively silent, the only sound the hum in my head, which had become a painful, incessant throb. I sifted through the records, searching for anything that might explain the creature, the pit, the hum, anything that could give me a way to stop it. Hours passed, the light outside fading into dusk, and still I found nothing. The frustration, the desperation gnawed at me. My hands shook as I pulled book after book from the shelves, my mind racing with fear and exhaustion. Then, just as I was about to give up, I found it. A brittle, leather-bound manuscript hidden among the stacks. The cover was unmarked, the pages inside written in a careful, flowing script. As I began to read, the hum in my head seemed to intensify, as if whatever was down there knew what I was about to uncover. The manuscript was written by a monk in the early 1700s, detailing a strange series of events that had occurred in the region long before the town of Taos was established. The monk spoke of a dark force that dwelled beneath the earth, a force that had been sealed away by ancient rites performed by the native tribes. According to the manuscript, the creature had been worshipped as a god by a long-forgotten people who had built a vast underground temple to house it. But over time, the creature's hunger had grown, and it had begun to corrupt those who worshipped it, driving them mad with its incessant hum until they turned on each other in a frenzy of bloodshed. The survivors had sealed the creature in the pit, burying the temple beneath layers of rock and earth, and the knowledge of its existence had been passed down in whispers, in legends, until even the memory of it was forgotten. But the monk had feared that the seal was weakening. He described strange occurrences, disappearances, madness happening in the area, and he warned that if the creature were ever to be awakened, it would bring ruin upon all who heard its call. The final entry sent a shiver down my spine. It calls to me now, in my sleep, in my waking hours. I fear I have not the strength to resist. It knows I have found it, and it will not stop until it is free. May God have mercy on my soul. The monk's fate was left unrecorded, but I didn't need the details to know what had happened to him. I was living it. The creature had been sealed away, but not destroyed. It had been waiting, biding its time, and now that I had found it, there was no escaping it. The manuscript offered no solutions, no answers, only despair. I felt the weight of my own fate pressing down on me. No matter what I did, no matter where I went, the creature would find me. It was inside me now, burrowing into my mind, twisting my thoughts, turning my own fears against me. As I sat there, the hum in my head reached a fever pitch, and I felt a sharp pain lancing through my skull. I doubled over, clutching my head, as the room seemed to spin around me, and then through the pain I heard it. The creature's voice, clear as day, speaking directly into my mind. "You will bring me what I seek. You cannot resist. You are mine." The words were like a command, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to obey. I knew then that it wasn't just calling me. It was controlling me, bending my will to its own. I had to get out, had to escape. But even as I thought it, I knew there was nowhere to run. Staggering to my feet, I left the mission, the manuscript clutched in my trembling hands. The night air was cold and biting, but it did nothing to clear the fog in my mind. The hum had become a relentless roar, drowning out everything else, and I knew that the creature was coming for me. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. All I knew was that I had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of the thing that was hunting me. But no matter how fast I ran, how far I went, the hum was always there, whispering in my ear, pulling me back toward the pit, toward the darkness. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, I was barely conscious, my vision blurring as the hum overwhelmed my senses. The ground beneath me seemed to shift and heave, as if the very earth was trying to swallow me whole. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The figure from the pit, standing at the edge of the forest, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It didn't move, didn't need to. The hum was its tether, and I was the puppet on the other end of the string. I fell to my knees, the manuscript slipping from my grasp as I fought to hold on to the last shreds of my sanity. But the creature's voice was in my head, whispering, demanding, and I couldn't fight it any longer. "Bring me what I seek," it said, and I knew then that it wasn't just after me. It wanted more. It wanted the town, the people, everything, and it would use me to get it. The town of Taos slept peacefully that night, unaware of the horrors that lurked just beneath its surface. But I wasn't sleeping. I was standing at the edge of the forest, staring into the inky darkness where the creature waited. The hum had become all-consuming, its relentless pulse driving out any trace of reason or fear. All that was left was the compulsion, the unyielding command that echoed through my mind. "Bring me what I seek." I didn't even know how I had gotten here. The last thing I remembered was falling to my knees on the outskirts of town, the manuscript slipping from my grasp. But now, here I was, my body moving on its own, driven by a force I couldn't resist. The creature stood motionless in the shadows, its glowing eyes locked onto mine. It didn't speak, but it didn't have to. The hum was its voice, its will, and it had me completely under its control. I knew what it wanted. It wanted me to bring it back to town, to lead it to the people it sought to consume. And I knew deep down that I couldn't stop it. But as I stood there, staring into the darkness, something flickered in the back of my mind. A memory. A spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished. Dr. Moore's face flashed before my eyes. her terror as the creature took her life, her desperate warning to me to get out, to run. And then the memory of the monk centuries ago, who had fought against the same force and failed, leaving only his words behind as a warning. I couldn't let it happen again. I couldn't let this creature destroy everything, to consume the town and everyone in it. But what could I do? How could I fight something so ancient, so powerful, when it had already taken control of my mind? And then, in a moment of clarity, I remembered something from Harrington's journal. The creature had been sealed away once before, buried beneath layers of earth and rock by those who had worshipped it. The seal had weakened over time, but if it had been done once, maybe, just maybe, it could be done again. I didn't know if I had the strength to resist the creature's control, but I had to try. Summoning every ounce of willpower I had left, I took a step back from the edge of the forest. The hum intensified, a sharp pain stabbing through my skull, but I gritted my teeth and forced myself to take another step. The creature's eyes narrowed, its form flickering in the darkness as if it sensed my defiance. The hum became a roar, a deafening cacophony that threatened to shatter my mind. But I kept moving, one step at a time, retreating from the forest, back toward the town. As I moved, I reached into my pocket and felt the cold metal of the old lighter I always carried. It was a simple thing, a gift from my father, but in that moment it felt like a lifeline. I flicked it open, the tiny flame springing to life, and I held it up as a talisman against the darkness. The creature recoiled, its form flickering more violently now, as if the flame was somehow repelling it. I didn't understand how or why, but I didn't care. All I knew was that it was working. Step by step, I forced myself away from the creature, back toward the mission where the manuscript lay discarded on the ground. The hum was still there, still pounding in my skull, but it was weakening, its control slipping as I put distance between us. When I reached the mission, I slammed the door shut behind me, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The manuscript was where I had left it, and I scooped it up, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. There had to be something in here, some way to seal the creature away for good. And then I found it, a passage near the end, written in the monk's trembling hand, describing the ritual used to seal the creature in the pit. It was a simple ritual, one that involved the burning of a specific kind of incense, and the recitation of an ancient chant passed down through generations. But the most important part was the intent behind it. The will to trap the creature, to banish it back to the depths from which it came. I had no incense, no ancient tools, but I had the lighter, and I had my will, fragile as it was, but still intact. It would have to be enough. Taking a deep breath, I made my way back to the pit. The tunnel was even darker than before, the walls seeming to close in around me as I descended. The hum was weaker now, but still present, still trying to pull me back into its grip. When I reached the pit, I could feel the creature's presence, seething with rage, waiting just beyond the edge of the darkness. It knew what I was trying to do, and it was furious. But I didn't let that stop me. Standing at the edge of the pit, I flicked the lighter open, the small flame illuminating the cavern. The creature recoiled again, its form shifting and distorting in the shadows. I began to chant, the words from the manuscript spilling from my lips in a language I didn't understand. But that felt right, felt powerful. As I chanted, I held the flame out over the pit, letting the words flow through me, imbuing them with every ounce of defiance, every drop of willpower I had left. The creature howled, a sound that shook the very ground beneath me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The hum reached a fever pitch, the sound so loud it felt like it was tearing my brain apart. But then, as I spoke the final words of the chant, the hum cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it was almost as deafening as the noise had been. The ground beneath me trembled, and I stumbled back as the pit began to collapse in on itself, the earth sealing the creature away, burying it beneath layers of rock and stone. The walls of the cavern shook, and I turned and ran, the sound of the tunnel collapsing behind me spurring me on. I burst out of the mine shaft just as the entrance caved in, sealing the creature away for good, or so I hoped. I collapsed onto the ground, my body racked with exhaustion, my mind numb with shock. But the hum was gone. The creature was gone. The town of Taos would be safe. But as I lay there staring up at the clear night sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence was too perfect, too complete. It felt wrong. And then I heard it. Faint at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. The hum, it was still there, buried deep beneath the earth, still calling out, still waiting. And I knew with a cold certainty that it would never truly be gone. The creature had been sealed away, but it hadn't been destroyed. It was still down there, waiting for the day when it would be freed once more. As I got to my feet, the hum growing louder in my ears, I realized that I had only delayed the inevitable. The creature's call would continue, reaching out to others, drawing them in, driving them mad. And one day someone else would answer, just as I had. And when that day came, the creature would rise again. I could only hope that whoever answered next would be strong enough to resist. The end.